anyone raised in the late 90s and early 2000s remembers that glorious era of some of the most action-packed, wish-fulfillment cartoons ever created. From the genre-defining Dragon Ball Z to the comedy action stylings of the Powerpuff Girls, there was no shortage of characters with mind-blowing powers for you to watch as a kid in your pajamas after stealing a soda from your parents' garage. But I'd argue that one of the most influential shows of this nature was the critically acclaimed Ed, Edd, and Eddy. After a somewhat slow and tame first season, this show became nuts. A non-stop barrage of relentless action with characters performing superhuman feats on a regular basis. Now, while the Dragon Ball Z fanbase has no shortage of power level comparison videos, for Ed, Edd, and Eddy fans, that task is a bit trickier, as many of the characters seem to be on a more even playing field. But I knew it could be done. I've watched every single episode, I've taken notes, and I've done my best to rank every single main character in this show in order to make what I hope will be the definitive Ed, Edd, and Eddy tier list. A quick disclaimer, I'll only be ranking the 12 staple main characters we've seen throughout the whole show. One-off characters like Ed's imaginary friend Jib, the alternate reality Cupid Jimmy and Sarah, and even Eddy's own brother won't be appearing on this list. I apologize to fans of these characters, but simply put, there's just not enough data to determine how well they'd stack up against everyone else. Also, yes, the characters in the individual tiers are ranked themselves, meaning characters further left are higher than the ones on the right. And one last thing, though it is a fan favorite, I won't be using data from 1 + 1 = Ed, as it's mostly a non-canon filler episode. So, without further ado, this is what did I call it? This is Gross Creepy Dork with Terrible Diction Productions, and let's Ed it up. First up, we have the D tier, and yeah, I doubt most people would be surprised seeing Jimmy at the very bottom. Now, I'm not saying that he has no redeeming qualities, because there are a few. It's shown that he can be rather crafty and cunning, coming up with his own successful scams, and there was even one time when he was able to deceive all 3 Eds, as well as the entire neighborhood, right under everyone's nose, so he gets some points for that. But the sheer amount of times he's been shown to be weak, accident-prone, cowardly, accident-prone, easily fooled, and yeah, did I mention accident-prone? Yeah, that just kind of outweighs any chance Jimmy had at rising from the bottom. In terms of physical strength, Jimmy's got pretty much nothing. He has occasionally managed to best some characters above him, but they've often been ones that are only a couple of notches higher. I mean, there was the episode Hand Me Down Ed, where Jimmy received a tremendous power boost, but that wasn't due to any training on his part, and was more achieved through the reality-altering powers of the boomerang. In fact, it was Jimmy's own lack of strength that made him so powerful when coming in contact with the artifact. The only other physical feat I can recall is his sumo wrestler transformation, causing him to become this immense and immovable object. But while this form does drastically increase his defense, it offers very little improvement to his offensive capabilities, and his mobility becomes practically nothing. In fact, Jimmy's greatest advantage, apart from his charismatic dance moves, is the close friendship he's established with one of the most powerful characters in the series, but that does very little to improve his own stats and likelihood of winning. Sorry there, Jimmy. Love you as a character, though. Let's move up to the C tier, where we have the first of our main trio. Now, in terms of physical strength, Double D is practically on Jimmy's level. His offensive capabilities are laughable, and his stamina is completely pitiful. But unlike Jimmy, Double D has some clearly defined and consistent skills that have the potential to make up for his weaknesses, mostly stemming from his intellect. Double D is one smart cookie, a character many believe to be the most intelligent one in the entire series, a sentiment that I'm not sure I quite agree with, but more on that later. His main strength would have to come down to his inventiveness. Double D has been able to build some amazing contraptions using nothing but everyday items found lying around. Not only that, but he's also been shown that he's able to build devices like this completely on the fly, proving that he's able to think quick on his feet. However, while these machines are decently effective for their intended purposes, in a combat scenario I feel like they wouldn't quite hold up as well. Their durability tends to be on the flimsy side due to the unstable methods of their construction. But still, Double D has created more simple and compact devices that would be able to make up for some of his physical limitations. But now we get back to the question of whether or not I believe Double D is the smartest character on the show, and, well, that all depends on how you look at it. In terms of being book smart, well, yeah, Double D has no equal. He's clearly very well educated in all sorts of texts and scientific research and stuff like that. Where I feel he lacks is in terms of things like street smarts and his social abilities, and sometimes even common sense. I mean, Double D has been fooled by some pretty obvious and ridiculous tricks in the past, usually as a result of his overly neurotic nature. He also seems to lack a certain sense of craftiness that many other characters possess. Given Double D's intellect, you'd think he'd have already studied and researched all the weaknesses of the cul-de-sac kids in order to be able to exploit them, but he kind of hasn't. In fact, Double D has made attempts to control others, and they've never worked out. There was the time he tried to suppress Eddy and Edd's mischievous behavior, but the two ended up turning the situation completely around on him, humiliating him in the process. Then there's the time he tried to control the entire cul-de-sac community in order to educate them, but he was completely ignorant to their interests, being blinded by his own ambitions to the point where he ultimately failed to engage any of them, and the whole plan crumbled around him. There is one exception to this, however, and it's with the other Edds. I suppose it's because he spends so much time with them, but he is actually able to deceive them and play to their own strengths and weaknesses. The episode Edds and Tails is a great example of that, where Eddy and Double D end up racing each other for a jawbreaker, with both of them employing all sorts of underhanded tactics in order to sabotage each other, and Double D is actually shown to be a decent match for Eddy here. I don't know, some people might disagree with this placement, but this is honestly how I feel about the character. Nez. Nez. The character with probably the goofiest sounding name in the whole show. Seriously, has anyone in the history of humanity ever named their child Naz? I kinda love it, not gonna lie. But what she lacks in a normal name, she makes up for with a rather interesting set of abilities, mostly stemming from her feminine charms. With Kevin, Double D, Eddy, Ed, and even Johnny at some points becoming completely infatuated by her. That's not the entire cast, mind you, but it's a good amount which she has some serious potential against. Now, her physical strength level is probably about a notch or two above Double D's, which isn't saying that much. There have been times where she's tried to confront characters far above her, and, yeah, they were some pretty pathetic attempts. Also, in terms of intelligence, well, she's not dumb, she isn't exactly shown to be the sharpest tool in the shed. But god, that infatuation ability, that can be absolutely devastating in the right scenario. What's ultimately holding her back are a couple of things. For starters, she doesn't seem to be all that aware of her own abilities, or at least not aware enough to actively train them, as she mostly appears to be completely oblivious to her potential. Now, there is exactly one time in the whole series where she purposely attempts to use these powers to her advantage, in the episode High-Heeled Eds, where she attempts to get the coveted golden pants from Eddy. However, she is ultimately unsuccessful in this attempt, thus proving how untested these abilities are. But I guess it does show that she is at least somewhat aware of them. Perhaps she doesn't tap into this power because it's too much for even her to handle, as seen in the episode Boys Will Be Eds, where she was completely overwhelmed by the effects of her own abilities. Another theory why she doesn't use this more would be due to her kind-hearted nature. She's probably the most morally just character in the entire show and is mostly a pacifist in nature, so using her abilities for more manipulative and self-serving reasons is probably not something she's all that fond of doing. All of this, coupled with the fact that her abilities have no effect on half of the cast, is why I can't put Naz any higher. Moving up a tier, and we come to arguably the main character of the show, who is a rather unconventional fighter. While Eddy does have some amount of physical strength and fighting technique, his main skill set comes from his tactics of manipulation and deception. Unlike Double D, Eddy has a vast understanding of the other kids' personalities, their desires, their strengths, weaknesses, fears, and he often uses this to his advantage. He's been able to successfully deceive every single other character on the show at least once, and often multiple times. A great example of this comes from the episode All Eds Are Off, where the characters each wager a quarter and swear off of one of their flanderized personality quirks, with the winner being whoever can go the longest without giving in. And Eddy does a dastardly cunning job of wearing down and emotionally breaking everyone else into submitting. However, Eddy's successes usually don't last very long and have a tendency to blow up in his and the other Edds' faces. But the fact that even after all these failed attempts, along with everyone's natural distrust of him, he still manages to pull off or come close to pulling off numerous schemes is just a testament to how strong Eddy's abilities can potentially be. Physically, I'd say Eddy is about average, maybe slightly below average. He's not shown to be particularly strong or skilled in head-to-head combat, but he is full of surprises, actually being able to hold his own and occasionally scoring some impressive blows on characters far stronger than him. A lot of Eddy's strength in this area comes from what the fanbase has dubbed the rage boost, when a character gives into their anger and emotions and receives a tremendous power boost as a result. And yeah, it's clear Eddy has some practice with this technique. However, prolonged exposure does take a toll on the body, so it's not a form that can be sustained with ease. Other strengths of his include a high stealth level, decent speed, an impressive pain tolerance, some type of minor voodoo shadow manipulation, being disturbingly adept at many forms of torture, and, surprisingly, having some inventing and engineering skills. Now, they're nowhere near as good as Double D's are, but Eddy has been shown to create a few contraptions entirely on his own. The culmination of his true power comes from the episode Out with the Old, In with the Ed, where Eddy, through several different tactics, actually manages to fool the entire cul-de-sac into believing that it was still summer, even as school was approaching the very next day. This is one impressive feat, even if it was eventually unmasked. And I suppose I also have to cover the controversial Ray of Riches technique from the episode Robin Ed. See, in this episode, Johnny and Eddy don comic book personas and have a little imaginary fight where, at one point, Eddy proceeds to fire a stream of energy projectiles, seemingly from his mind. Now, the fanbase is rather torn on this move, as some argue it's entirely imaginary, stemming from the fictional nature of the fight, while others try to argue that it's real due to Johnny's physical reaction to the attack. I strongly side with the former here, because, come on. If Eddy really had access to an ability like this, don't you think he'd attempt to use it at least one other time? So, yeah, I'm not counting this move. But now it's time to discuss Eddy's flaws, and boy, he sure has some big ones. Eddy is sadistic, extremely petty, and has one delusional ego. He seems to have actually fooled himself into believing he's more well-liked and popular than he really is, and will often go to drastic, borderline psychotic lengths just to prove it, while getting easily provoked by the smallest of things. Johnny and Jimmy playfully declare Plank as king of the cul-de-sac? Well, clearly Eddy thinks he should be king, so he coerces the entire cul-de-sac into an election campaign, all in order to satisfy his own ego. Everyone's giving Jimmy a bunch of attention after he's sustained an injury? Well, Eddy sees this, gets jealous, and then goes through the process of trying to have as much pain inflicted on him as possible, delighting in the sympathy he's about to receive. Yeah, Eddy's shown to be a bit mentally and emotionally unstable on multiple occasions. For example, in the episode Luck of the Edds, after Ed forgets where he hides Eddy's porno magazines, Eddy becomes increasingly paranoid and distrustful to an almost irrational level. And then there's the episode Laugh, Ed Laugh, where without anyone to scam, Eddy's immense boredom causes him to snap and he completely loses his goddamn mind. Overall, this is a dangerous combination of personality traits that ends up hurting him a lot more than they help. One aspect of Eddy's character I believe to be both a blessing and a curse would be his insatiable greed. It's definitely caused him his fair share of problems, but it can also provide a benefit that's very similar to the rage boost. The rush of adrenaline Eddy receives as a result of this greed sometimes causes him to push himself far beyond his physical and mental limits, such as in the episode The Edds Are Coming, where Eddy suppresses any fear of potential alien invaders, charging in head first in hopes of capturing one for profit. Whew. Okay, I think that's enough about Eddy. I could honestly go on, but we have to move on to other characters. Next we have our very first character of notable physical strength. Yeah, Kevin is no pushover when it comes to combat, being able to hold his own against a good amount of the cast with his brutal fighting techniques. However, as tough as Kevin may be, I don't believe he's quite as strong as many give him credit for, and I feel his greatest strengths come down to both his charisma and authority. Kevin has managed to win the respect and adoration of almost every kid in the cul-de-sac, all due to his cool demeanor, impressive showy stunt work, and not to mention his entire garage full of jawbreakers that he gives out on a regular basis. But if you notice, throughout the series, Kevin actually doesn't do all that much fighting on his own, being much more likely to rally all the other kids together for a group attack. Now, like I said before, Kevin is no slouch in combat, but I do think even he realizes that there are others on his side who are even stronger than him, so he often gets their help in order to increase his odds of victory. On his own, Kevin has actually been caught off guard and overwhelmed, leading to his defeat at the hands of opponents he's usually capable of defeating. But Kevin has the confidence and courage that often have him taking charge of a situation and leading the others. This status tends to lend Kevin an imposing authority, often making his enemies think twice before crossing him. In terms of intelligence, Kevin isn't too bright, but he does have a decent amount of common sense. He's by far the least trusting of the Edds and their schemes, which allow him to catch on to things before most of the others. This distrust has worked to his detriment once before, but apart from that, it's usually a benefit. While Kevin does have his strengths, I do believe that there are a lot of characters who could still beat him if they were forced to fight. They usually don't, though, since they're almost always on the same side. Now, Johnny here is the wild card of the show, the ultimate chaotic neutral character. Definitely the most unpredictable combatant on the roster. I can never quite get a read on this guy, and I don't think anyone else in the show can either. For example, sometimes he'll be fighting against the Edds, but other times he'll join forces with them and try to help them out. Much like Nez, Johnny seems to be a bit of a pacifist in nature. He comes off as a strange boy living in his own little world, being easily amused by the simplest of things. However, I'm not exactly sure how much of this is real, and how much of it is a mask he puts on in order to lull his opponents into a false sense of security around him. I think it's a combination of both, honestly. Probably a little more of the former than the latter. Johnny is a happy-go-lucky, quirky kid, but I don't think he's quite as oblivious as he leads on. See, Johnny's greatest power comes from his mind game potential, being able to toy with people and have them playing his game, and nowhere is this shown better than with his best friend Plank. I'm gonna be frank here. Despite what some may believe, Plank, in a literal sense, is nothing more than just an ordinary hunk of wood with a face. He doesn't have any supernatural powers or any actual consciousness of his own. However, despite this, Plank does actually have his own personality and characteristics separate from Johnny's, but they all stem from Johnny's imagination. He is so thoroughly convinced that Plank is alive that he gets everyone else, who all know Plank is nothing more than an ordinary hunk of wood, to fully acknowledge him as a separate person and play along with Johnny's game. But like I said before, Johnny is largely a pacifist in nature, mostly concerned with just having fun and occasionally standing up for mutant rights. So he hardly ever uses any of his abilities for ill intent. But when he does, oh boy, he and Plank are able to play people like a fiddle. One of the best examples of this, of course, comes from Gimme Gimme Never Ed, where Johnny and Plank end up toying with the Edds throughout the whole episode, getting them to build increasingly more elaborate and expensive thrill rides for Plank, and then, through one decisive move, they end up swiftly defeating all three, getting their money back in the process. And this isn't the only occasion where the Edds attempted to use Johnny for one of their schemes, only for him to turn the tables on them in the end. That's not to say Johnny is a complete genius or anything. He is shown to be easily duped, easily impressed, or easily distracted as a result of his carefree nature. And another drawback that Johnny happens to share with Eddy would be his, less than stable mental state, which is probably even more apparent here, often being pointed out by the other characters.
Who knows what this will do to Johnny when he sees this, Eddy? His ties to reality are already tenuous at best.
So, The kid weirds me out too! Look at him!
See, whenever Johnny is separated from Plank, he tends to lose it, either falling into a deep depression, paranoia, or becoming manically dependent on others. And by the end of the series, Johnny completely snaps. But seeing as it was the final scene of the whole show, we're ultimately unable to tell what this transformation was capable of. As far as direct combat capabilities, Johnny can be surprisingly competent, but only when he's motivated by some outside force, causing him to make some decently effective use of the Rage Boost form, such as when the Edds destroyed his house, or when Plank was captured by the Cankers, in which case Johnny actually managed to pull off one of the most impressive strategic victories in the whole series. The only other main time Johnny engaged in direct combat was for his own amusement as he donned his Captain Melonhead persona. In this form, though, Johnny is able to take advantage of a move called the Melon Rush, where he builds up an incredible amount of speed and charges headfirst into his opponent, and unlike the Ray of Riches, this was actually shown to be a real move he can take advantage of. So yeah, that's Johnny. Now we move on to the A tier, and this was probably the hardest tier for me to rank. All three characters I have ranked here are pretty similar in power levels, but I dug into my notes to see what kind of attributes some had over others. So, at the bottom of A, we have our final member of the main trio. Now, in terms of raw physical strength, yeah, no one surpasses Ed. This is the guy who's able to effortlessly lift an entire house over his head. This leads the more casual fans to deem him as an undisputed S tier, but amongst the true fans, we know that isn't quite the case. You see, raw strength isn't everything, and Ed's overwhelming power is balanced out by having the lowest intelligence level out of every other fighter. Ed doesn't have any fighting techniques, any strategy, any sort of skills in combat outside of just being really, really strong. This frequently causes him to be easily defeated by characters who are often far weaker than him strength-wise. But let's not underestimate him either. I'm placing him this high for a reason. He is damn strong, and if he tries his hardest, has a good chance of defeating many of the cul-de-sac kids. Ed might seem like a predictable one-trick pony, and for the most part he is, but he does have access to quite a few unique forms that he's managed to see some success with. One of the most popular being the monster form. Ed was actually able to subdue a good amount of the roster with this, however, it wasn't due to any significant power boost granted by the transformation, but more so the fear it induced from the other kids believing he was a real monster, so it isn't all that reliable now that the ruse is up. Ed also once entered one hell of a rage boost state, which even managed to intimidate his sister, Sarah, but this was a very rare occurrence born out of discomfort from one particular pebble in his shoe. But there's still one other form that I believe to be Ed's most effective transformation, and that would have to be his Lothar form from the Halloween special, based off of some Viking warrior character from one of his movies. With this one, Ed was actually able to apply some technique to his fighting style, albeit ones he mimics from television, but he was actually shown to be more than a capable fighter with this. Yeah, but the thing is, these forms are ultimately pretty unreliable due to the specific and rare circumstances they require to unlock. So, yeah. Next up, I can already tell this is going to be a controversial choice. Boom! Marie Canker! Now, I know what you're thinking. What? Joe, you're putting a Canker sister this low? And it isn't Mae? You're actually putting Marie below Mae. Alright. Let me explain. Yes, the Canker sisters are the most powerful and feared group in the entire cul-de-sac. The mere mention of their names is enough to make people shit themselves, and yes, as a group they're an almost unbeatable force. But I'm not counting them as a group, am I? I'm counting them individually, and unfortunately, Marie doesn't have as much to show on her own. Now, don't get me wrong, she's no pushover, and she has a couple of solo victories under her belt, showing that she is quite a capable fighter. But much like Kevin, she seems to do most of her fighting as part of a group rather than on her own. Fitting how they're voiced by the same actress, too.
Watching them run around so much is making my armpits sweaty.
Hey, dork! Say cheese!
By herself, Marie has actually been shown to struggle against some characters like Johnny and, well, especially her sisters. I mean, sure, she does manage to score some hits against them, particularly Mae, but these confrontations usually don't last long enough to determine an outcome, and I'll get more into this later when I talk about her sisters, but while Mae is often treated as the butt of the group, often getting pushed around by both of her sisters, I think Marie knows, deep down, that Mae is actually stronger than her. Take the Valentine's Day special Hanky Panky Hullabaloo, for example, where Mae and Double D end up falling in love with each other, mostly resulting from the interference from an alternate reality Jimmy and Sarah. And because Double D happens to be Marie's main Ed, yeah, she's not too happy about that. Now, romance is something the Kankers take very seriously, so you think all this rage bubbling inside of her would cause Marie to directly confront Mae, perhaps even challenge her in a head-to-head fight, but nope, she doesn't. Instead, choosing to simply vent her frustrations through passive-aggressive artwork. It's only after getting Lee to also disapprove of the relationship that she decides to do anything about it, with Lee at her side, of course. This, to me, proves that Marie Kanker might actually be the weakest link of the Kanker sisters, and I do think there are a couple of characters that could beat her. And if you could, please hold off on your comments until you see my description of Mae. Then feel free to comment away. But who knows, it's shown from a deleted scene in one episode that Marie does drastically bulk up in the future, so perhaps she becomes even stronger then. And at the top of A tier, I'm placing Rolf. Now, in the beginning of the series, Rolf wasn't all that impressive. He was probably around Kevin's level, showing some decent strength and competent fighting abilities, but at the same time he could also be defeated or deceived rather easily. His lack of understanding of his current environment also didn't help with that. But, Rolf's been doing some serious training, and has managed to significantly increase his strength, durability, and fighting techniques. The constant farm work he does on a daily basis has pushed Rolf far beyond what he once was, having probably the most drastic increase in power levels of any character throughout the seasons. Watching the Season 5 episode, Boom Out Goes the Ed, it's apparent just how far Rolf has come, in comparison to a character like Kevin, who's done very little training and has just sort of stayed at a flat constant. While not quite possessing the raw strength of Ed, Rolf has performed some impressive physical feats. This includes tearing down trees, crushing boulders, and even being able to push his entire house several feet back. Though Rolf does have strength to spare, it's his fighting technique and combat skills that truly put him at this spot. Using a variety of weapons from his bare hands to pitchforks, a large fish, his hat of discipline, and even his own goddamn shoe. He also has a whole farm full of animals with some decent power levels at his beck and call. Most notably Victor the Goat and Wilfred the Pig, with Wilfred in particular having some great synergy and combo moves with Rolf. Now, he occasionally struggles with controlling these animals sometimes, but they're still reliable enough to be seen as a positive addition to his arsenal. He also has the ability to completely shatter any form of armor with a single well-placed strike, and couple that with his canine level of smell and tracking abilities, and it pretty much makes any form of defensive play practically worthless, especially when in the woods, where he's able to pick off his opponents one by one. Taking him head-on is really your best bet, but that won't be easy, especially with his high durability and pain tolerance. Now you're probably thinking, well, Rolf here sounds like an unstoppable machine, and yes, he can be. Once he gets going, that is. See, Rolf's techniques, more so than any other character, relies on a sense of momentum. Once he gets going, he's a beast. But if his opponent is able to catch him off guard early on, it can sort of throw him off and lead to his defeat. This has made Rolf probably one of the most inconsistent fighters in the show's run. Other weaknesses include the aforementioned lack of understanding of the environment he's in, as well as certain tasks that are outside his comfort zone, such as the entire public education system and especially spelling bees. It's also shown that a constant protein diet is basically the source of his strength, as without it his power level drastically drops. Another, albeit unconventional strength of Rolf's would be his lack of sexual urges? I can't believe I'm actually using that sentence in an Ed, Edd and Eddy video. But yeah, Rolf isn't shown to have any attraction to either gender, which is often depicted as a weakness for so many characters. This led him to be the only one to catch on to the shenanigans of the alternate universe Jimmy and Sarah, thus promptly defeating them and undoing the love spell they put on everyone.
Come here often, big boy. What happened? Weaklings?
S Tier, here we go! No more fucking around. First up, we've got Ed's little sister Sarah, and oh boy, this little kid's a threat. Now, I've mentioned the rage boost before, and we've seen quite a few characters dabble in this technique, but Sarah has downright mastered it. She's able to unleash this form in the blink of an eye, sustain it for extended periods of time, and take full advantage of it without suffering any of the drawbacks. You see, in her base form, Sarah honestly isn't all that powerful. The problem is, she's rarely ever in just her base form, always keeping some lingering amount of rage power flowing inside of her, so she's able to more easily crank it up to 11 at a moment's notice. Remember that point in Dragon Ball Z where Goku and Gohan mastered the Super Saiyan transformation and they were able to just walk around in that form like it was nothing? Well, that's basically what we have going on here. For most characters, having a bad temper would be a drawback, but Sarah takes this flaw and weaponizes it, making her a goddamn bulldozer plowing over anyone who's in her way. Oh, and if you think her temper is the result of a lack of control over her emotions, please. Sarah has a tremendous control over her emotions, putting aside all other feelings except blind rage when needed. For example, she does happen to have a minor little crush on Double D, but that sure doesn't stop her from beating the shit out of him on numerous occasions if she has to. One of the only weaknesses that Sarah does have, besides there being a couple of characters even stronger, is that, well, she's pretty young, and thus her naivete can get the better of her. I used a big boy word. She has suffered some defeats in the past, but she's usually able to somewhat work around them, even through more cunning and duplicitous means. And there's honestly not much more I can say about Sarah. Next up, Boom. Like I said before, Mae is often seen as the lowest of the Kanker sister trio due to how her sisters are constantly picking on her and belittling her. But I'd like to argue that she is much more powerful than she leads on. Her biggest weakness is that she is pretty dim-witted. Not quite down to Ed's level, but still not a very bright or perceptive individual. She's kind of like a combination of the Kanker attitude mixed with Ed's stupidity and Johnny's more carefree outlook on life. Which is why her sisters, even the less powerful Marie, are able to frequently bully her. She's not quite as bossy as them, and even seems to be rather content with her status. But unlike Naz or Johnny, it doesn't take much to provoke her to fight back, particularly against Marie, who she usually exchanges equal blows with. So at the very least they're at the same level, right? Well, that's how it seems. But in actuality, Mae has an enormous and frightening amount of hidden power stored up inside of her. Power that, when unleashed, goes far beyond a simple rage boost and transcends to a nearly godlike level. First being shown in the episode Ed Overboard, after her sisters pull a vicious prank that ends up pushing her way too far, and then, boom, it happens. Mae's power level explodes to immeasurable proportions as her sisters are completely overwhelmed, forcing even Lee to take cover and try to come up with some sort of strategy to subdue her. Luckily for them, she is calmed down by the doll of her love interest, Ed. But I want you to pay close attention to what happens afterwards. Mae seems to be in a vulnerable state right now. Her defenses appear to be lowered, and, well, she's crying. Lee then has Marie check up on her, and upon seeing the current state she's in, Marie believes that the coast is clear and proceeds to mock and belittle her. And then, BAM! Let's break this down now. So despite the fact that Mae is currently in tears, completely unaware of her surroundings, the power she's emanating is so great that a projectile is launched directly at Marie, shutting her up. I mean, wow. That was probably done subconsciously too, without Mae even noticing it happen. That is insane and, frankly, terrifying. We actually don't see Mae tap into this level of power again until hanky-panky hullabaloo. Once again, she was being teased by her sisters about her Valentine's Day card, and once again, her power level skyrockets, and she's able to swiftly overpower both sisters. However, this time, she appears to have much more control over this power. Now, it's never directly stated or shown, but it is heavily implied and speculated that Lee has actually been training Mae off-screen in order to get her to better harness this unfathomable potential. So, much like several other characters on this list and their immense power boosts, this seems to be one that's only triggered under the right circumstances. Yes, this can be true. So why is Mae Canker this high then? Well, several reasons. 1. She's already an extremely adept and capable fighter. I mean, she is a Canker after all. 2. The sheer overwhelming nature of this transformation, well, simply put, it makes all the others pale in comparison. And 3. This one seems like it's easier to bring out of her than, say, Ed's Lothar form, which requires a specific combination of circumstances to bring out, including the right time, place, combination of movies, and an unrealistic charge-up period while he watches the movies for there to even be a chance that Ed will be inspired enough to take the form. Mae's is more reasonable, stemming from a combination of rage and insecurity, which aren't very hard emotions to bring out of a kid her age. And one last thing, Mae's also the only Canker who seems to actually brush her teeth, so she actually has the highest breath power level of the three. And finally, we get to the S+ tier. And by process of elimination, the most powerful character in Ed, Edd, and Eddy. There's a reason why the Cankers are the most dominant and feared force in the entire cul-de-sac, and that reason is Lee fucking Canker. Sure, her sisters are formidable in their own right, but they don't even come close to the absolute demanding presence and authority stemming from Lee's dominant level of power and abilities. In terms of those physical power levels, what can I say? She's off the charts, excelling in every stat and then some. Lee Canker is the closest thing to a god in the Ed, Edd, and Eddy universe, and unfortunately for the denizens of the cul-de-sac, she's not a benevolent one, seeking only to spread chaos and misery while satiating her own lusts and desires. Okay, now you might be saying, that's a little far, Joe, and yeah, you might be right, that god line was a little ridiculous, but I don't know, I thought it might have sounded cool. I mean, there are plenty of times where she's traded equal blows while sparring with her sisters, right? So is she really that much stronger than them? Yes, she is. Seriously, Lee is leagues above her sisters. Sure, Mae has her overwhelming power boost, but it's still a bit unrefined, and Lee can both outmaneuver and outwit her. As for the trading equal blows thing, you seriously think Lee is fighting at her max power? Think about it. Her character is all about delighting in sick and twisted thrills, and if she were to always fight at full power, life would become far too predictable and boring for her. Pay close attention to when the Cankers are sparring with one another. Often you'll see the three battling it out on a more equal level at first, but as soon as Lee's had enough and things need to get serious, she simply turns her power up a notch and then effortlessly puts an end to the fight. Now, that's not to say Lee is untouchable, far from it. Unlike, say, Dragon Ball Z, the enemies in Ed, Edd, and Eddy aren't portrayed as these unflinching walls in order to artificially increase tension without expending much creative effort. At the end of the day, these characters are still technically human, and humans are vulnerable creatures. So, as powerful as Lee is, she still can get caught off guard and take damage, with the most notable occurrence of this being from, believe it or not, Double D, when he accidentally dropped a heavy object on her foot. Now, this wasn't enough to be considered a definitive defeat, in my opinion, as Lee could have easily beaten Double D even with this injury. She just saw little point in doing so at the moment. Now, usually her losses come from being incapacitated or distracted long enough for her opponents to make an escape from her. But these are more of the exception than the rule. And in addition to her immense power levels, Lee is also extremely crafty and cunning. She may not be as book smart as Double D, but she knows how to read people and get what she wants while toying with them in her sadistic and inventive ways. She is not a very easy woman to fool, and on the rare occurrences you do manage to pull one over on her, odds are she'll quickly catch on, so you won't be getting away with it for long. Her godlike predictions and plotting capabilities are almost on Jigsaw's level. When the Cankers set up an elaborate set of scenarios and contraptions, and the Edds fall for every last one of them down to a T, well, you know who the brains behind that operation was, seeing as her sisters are far more easily distracted and prone to whine and bicker with each other. And the scariest part is, I don't think we've even seen the full extent of Lee's power. The closest we've ever come is in the episode Run for Your Ed, where the Cankers' special family heirloom was accidentally stolen by Ed, causing the three of them to go on an unrelenting rampage in order to find it, resulting in the most devastating level of destruction ever seen in the series. Now, it's hard to tell how much of this is Lee's own doing, and how much of it is the result of Mae letting loose, and to that end, the fanbase isn't exactly sure. Lee is usually more level-headed and able to hold herself back, but I feel the loss of their ship in a bottle may have tipped her a bit over the edge, so I believe this is a combination of the both of them, along with a little help from Marie, of course. I'm just gonna record something right now in like 10 seconds while I'm at the shore with my friends here because I don't really have an ending written out for this video. So like, comment, and subscribe. Seriously though, let me know what you think, because this is kind of a bit of a weird video, and I want to know what you guys have to say about it.